Hello and welcome to the Targeted Translation Research Accelerator information session focused on round 3 of the research project's funding opportunity. We are glad you could all join us today. My name is Mena Lau, the Acting Senior Director for the TTRA program at MTPConnect, and I'll be your facilitator this morning. I would like to first begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the many lands we are meeting on today. I'm personally on the land of the Darug and the Ku-ring-gai people in New South Wales and pay my respects to their elders past, present and the emerging. I also extend that respect to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today for this information session. Now, before we launch into the session, I would like to run through a few pieces of housekeeping. Today's session will include a presentation providing a broad overview of the TTRA program in its entirety, and then drilling down into the key details of the research project's funding opportunity. This will be followed by a dynamic panel discussion on the selection criteria for this round, with representatives from our TTRA program partners and the co-design group. Following this, we'll then open up the session to answer any questions audience members may have. To submit questions, please use the Q&A box, not the chat box, which should be available at the bottom of your screen in your Zoom toolbar. If you have the same question as someone else, you can upvote, which will raise the question to the top of the list. Questions can be submitted anonymously, but if there is need for any follow-up, we won't be able to reach to you. The TTRA team can be contacted via our TTRA email address, which is displayed in the top right-hand corner of this slide. We request that the audience members hold off on your submitting questions until the end of the presentation, as your questions may be answered during the course of this information session content, and it will assist us in working through the questions at the end. For audience members who have questions about whether their research project is within scope or aligns to the priority areas identified, we'll appreciate if you contact us directly via our TTRA email address so we can gather the relevant information from you to make this assessment. We won't be able to have that two-way dialogue during this information session. For those who wish to review this presentation at a later date, or if you have colleagues who couldn't attend, a recording will be made available as an on-demand video on the MTPConnect website before the end of the week. We'll notify all registrants when it is published. We'll also be turning this session into a podcast episode as well for anyone who wants to listening on the go. So now I would like to introduce to the team. I'll be joined today by my TTRA colleagues at MTPConnect, Dr. Erin McClellan, TTRA Acting Director, and Dr. Ndiom Paladay, TTRA Associate Project Manager. Additionally, we are fortunate to also hearing from representatives of our program partners, Megan Campbell from OSHI, Dr. Michelle Kennedy from Lucha, and as well as our co-design group members who guided the design of the round 3 application, Chris Lee from NATRO and Deanne Minicom from Diabetes Australia. Annabelle Tan, who is the partner from End Health, is unable to be here today, but her colleague Grace Lithlin is online, as well as Olivia White from NDPP, Dr. Lee Ford and Dr. Andrew Harvey from UniQuest. We're all working behind the scenes and may respond to questions in the Q&A box. So first, let me tell you a bit more about MTPConnect. We're a not-for-profit industry growth centre that was set up in 2015. Can we have the next slide, please? So the MTPConnect is a industry growth centre set up in 2015 to support the growth of the medical technology, biotechnology, and the pharmaceutical sectors. We are here to champion the sector by working with all stakeholders across the MTP value chain in meaningful ways to advocate as a trusted, independent advisor, promote greater collaborations nationally as well as internationally, and to drive innovation and productivity. MTPConnect also delivers funding for strategic initiatives. As summarized in this next slide, MTPConnect is currently deploying more than $182 million of funding on behalf of the Department of Industry, Science and Resources and the Department of Health with its MRFF initiative. Through DISA, the Growth Centre program supports 40 projects that focus on infrastructure or capacity and capability building, including the establishment of the Bridge Tech and Bridge program, and more recently, the Australian Antimicrobial Resistant Network and the Industry Genomics Network. On the Department of Health side, we're currently operating 5 MRFF initiatives. The Biomedtech Horizon Programs, BMTH, the Biomedical Translation Bridge Program, BTB, Clinical Translation and the Commercialization MedTech Program, CTCM, have all now completed the funding rounds, with significant funding injected to nurture the translation of medical innovations through to the commercial proof of concept or early clinical trial stage. READY, our research exchange and development within industry program, is aiming to drive skills development and workforce training in the sector by supporting workshops, fellowships, and internships for researchers and clinicians to get industry experience, as well as mentoring program for PhD students and early career researchers. The details are on the MTPConnect website, which we encourage to access if you're interested. And finally, TTRA, which is the program that we'll be focusing on today. So the TTRA stands for the Targeted Translation Research Accelerator. It's a $47 million program specifically designed to provide a new integrated research program to improve the prevention, management, and treatment of diabetes and cardiovascular disease and their associated complications in Australia. The TTRA funding is drawn from the Public and Preventative Health Research Initiative of MRFF, so there is a focus and balance on public health, health equity approaches, as well as commercial objectives. The ultimate goal here is to see Australian diabetes and cardiovascular disease research tend into new treatments for patients, a reduction in the burden of chronic disease, and the flow-on benefits like saving on our health systems and job growth. So the TTRA is deployed across 2 key pillars. As you can see on this slide, the first was to establish through a competitive process 2 national research centres, one for diabetes and one for cardiovascular disease. The Australian Centre for Accelerating Diabetes Innovations, or ACADI, and the Australian Stroke and the Heart Research Accelerator, or ASTRA, were both announced as the funding recipients in January 2022 by the Minister for Health and Aged Care. They were funded for 4 years through the TTRA with $10 million each, and there is an expectation that both centres will be sustainable thereafter. In addition to the delivery of research portfolio and the training programs, both centres have placed a focus on finding solutions to reduce health inequities, as well as support health workforce development for the Indigenous communities. In addition to their research centres, TTRA also provides contestable funding opportunities to support individual diabetes and cardiovascular disease research projects. And to date, $11.9 million has been awarded to 16 research projects through 2 rounds, attracting an additional $17.7 million in contributions from academia and the industry. And these projects are addressing the priority areas called for in diabetes and cardiovascular disease and their associated complications, and progressing digital health, medical devices, therapeutics, as well as standalone behavioral interventions. To support and incentivize translation as a natural course of activity for those both applying as well as receiving funding from us, MTPConnect has also partnered with leading organizations to support mentoring and commercialization, as well as implementation advice. The TTRA program aims to maximize its investment by funding targeted needs. And for this reason, the priority areas that informed all the funding calls to date were identified through an evidence-based national coordinated health sector needs assessment. With this approach, we hope to see accelerated clinical impact for those who need it most. Although we recognize that previous approaches have its limitations, such that the previous needs assessment didn't truly represent the needs of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. So to really deliver targeted impact into those underrepresented populations, for the third and the final round of the TTRA research project funding opportunity, we're focusing specifically on supporting diabetes and cardiovascular disease projects that address the unmet health and medical needs of the Indigenous people in rural, remote, regional, and urban centres. And you'll later hear from Aaron the needs assessment process that we undertook in this round to identify the Indigenous specific priority areas. As I can see now, we have close to 100 people online today, which is a fantastic turnout. So to find out a little bit more about who is joining us today, we'll be running 3 quick polls. So you'll see on your screen 3 polling questions. The first is to find which organization type you're from. And the second is to learn about which modality or modalities that you're most interested in. So you can take all that's applicable. And lastly, whether you have any experience in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health research. So I can see the polling question now being popped up. So I'll give a bit more time for everyone to complete this poll. So again, for the first 2 questions, there are multiple choice, and you can tick more than one as needed about your organization type, and as well as about your modality interest. And finally, there's a single choice question about your experience in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health research. Okay, so how is it going from our side about people's answers coming through? Deb, should we give a bit more time? Oh, good.
Answers are coming through. Happy to share.
Okay, great. Thanks, Deb. All right. Okay, so for the first question, what type of organization are you from? We can see majority, 57% of our audience today are from the university, 17% from Medical Research Institute. We have 7% coming from community-controlled organization, 18% from corporation or small to medium enterprises, also 5% from the corporate, Commonwealth, state or territory government bodies, and 7% other. So it is quite a diverse audience we have today. That's excellent. Second question, which modalities are you interested in? So it looks like it's quite a nice spread. The first one's leading 63% is on health service innovation, followed by digital health at 44%. Then we have therapeutics at 35%, medical devices at 29%, and we'll also have 20% on other. Okay. So we have, like I said before, we have modality partners on the call. So during the Q&A question, you can also ask specific questions around your modalities as well. So on question 3, do you have any experience in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health research? Oh, so it's very close. Essentially, it's almost 50-50. So yes at 49% and no at 51%. Okay, that's awesome. So I think this really gives a really good insight for us to know the type of potential applicants we might receive in the areas that you'd like to hear more. So now I would like to welcome Erin to take us through the details of the needs assessment that we undertook for this round 3, as well as the funding opportunities.
Thank you, Manna, and hello, everybody. I'm joining you today from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. And like Manna, I extend those respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us on the call today. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of an overview of the why and the how behind round 3 before covering some of the specifics of the round and the application process. If I can have the next slide, please. So I'm sure it comes as no surprise to anybody joining us in the audience that the prevalence of diabetes and cardiovascular disease is significantly higher in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people compared with the wider population in Australia. These graphs show that very clearly, and they show that that's true across all age groups. However, prevalence statistics don't tell the whole story, and what they don't show is that for those living with diabetes and cardiovascular disease, outcomes are worse for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. That is, they're more likely to be hospitalised, more likely to develop complications, and mortality is also higher. So there is very clearly a gap and unmet need where considerable effort is needed to reduce this inequity. As Mana has mentioned, one of the central objectives of the TTRA program is to target funding at areas of greatest need within diabetes and cardiovascular disease in order to maximise the impact of the funding that's available. This is precisely why each round has specific priority areas to be addressed, and why we have conducted a needs assessment prior to each round to determine these areas of greatest need. For previous rounds, we have prioritised areas that are significant unmet needs within diabetes. Sorry, we'll just go back to the previous slide, please. Within diabetes and cardiovascular disease, and this has enabled us to fund some truly innovative projects that will likely have significant positive impact. However, because of the methods we've used for previous needs assessments, we're not able to know whether or not these were also areas of highest priority for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and communities. So less than 1% of the underlying data that was gathered to inform those needs assessments came from individuals that identified as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. So that's less than the proportion of the population that's Indigenous, which is around 3.2%, and it's certainly less than the proportion of people with diabetes or cardiovascular disease that are Indigenous. So for these reasons, round 3 will of course focus on the unmet diabetes and cardiovascular disease needs of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and communities. And this requires determining Indigenous specific priority areas using appropriate culturally sensitive methods. Next slide, please. So recognising those limitations of our previous needs assessments, it was clear that we needed to change the approach for this round. It's absolutely essential that Indigenous priority setting is Indigenous-led. So to guide the design and delivery of the round 3 needs assessment process, we brought together the TTRA Indigenous Advisory Group. As you can see, this group includes prominent Indigenous researchers, clinicians and thought leaders, as well as representatives from organisations that have deep engagement with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities through direct healthcare delivery. We're extremely honoured to have been able to work with such a group of incredible individuals, and they've all been very generous with their time and guidance. And in the interest of transparency, I wanted to quickly note that we have been very careful to manage potential conflicts of interest. Many of this group, I'm sure you're aware, are active researchers within the diabetes and cardiovascular disease fields, and we didn't want to prevent any of them from being able to apply for the funding should the priorities align with their work. So we've set the process up in such a way that Indigenous Advisory Group members are eligible to apply for round 3 funding unless they were part of our co-design group that directly worked with us to develop the selection criteria and application process for the round. Next slide, please. At the recommendation of the Indigenous Advisory Group, MTPConnect commissioned the Lowitja Institute to lead the needs assessment process for round 3. Lowitja Institute is a community-controlled organisation and Australia's National Institute for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health Research. Throughout the needs assessment and prioritisation project, Lowitja Institute consulted with the Indigenous Advisory Group and centred the voices and experiences of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities in every single aspect of the process. And this was to ensure that the priorities identified will have an enduring positive impact on health and wellbeing for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. As a quick note, the artwork that you can see here was created as part of this process, and we thank the artist, Jordan Lovegrove, and Lowitja Institute for allowing MTPConnect to use this work as part of our round 3 activities. Next slide, please. So the prioritisation project designed by the Lowitja Institute involved 4 key steps. The first step, identification, focused on identifying unmet health and medical needs for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with respect to diabetes and cardiovascular disease. So using a variety of channels, topics and areas of unmet needs for assessment were identified, and it's important to note that this step also continued throughout steps 2 and step 3 to ensure that there was adequate opportunity for all unmet needs to be identified and considered during the prioritisation step. For step 2, development, the Lowitja Institute worked with the Indigenous Advisory Group to develop specific criteria for prioritisation. So these criteria were used to assess each area of unmet need to provide a priority rating during the prioritisation step. The criteria were the status of the unmet need, the potential impact of Sorry, I'm just seeing that I've been asked to slow down. The criteria with the status of the unmet need, the potential impact of research funding, the sustainability and effectiveness of the investment, and lastly, the equitability of opportunities of investment. For step 3, prioritisation, a roundtable discussion was held, bringing together members of the Indigenous Advisory Group and other stakeholders from a variety of sectors to discuss areas of unmet need and to complete that assessment of priority. Each unmet need did receive a priority rating through that process, and topics that were rated highest were used to set the priority areas for round 3. The final step, endorsement, the step is not quite complete, but it did include the endorsement of the priority areas by the Indigenous Advisory Group and the TTRA Expert Advisory Board. This has obviously already been done, as those priority areas have been published in the funding guidelines and on the MTPConnect website. But the final part of the step is the publication of a discussion paper, which will detail the entire process, as well as the results from the needs assessment. And this paper is currently in development by Lowitja Institute. Next slide, please. So these are the 3 priority areas that were determined through that process. I won't read them out to you. You can have a read if you like, and they're also, as I said, in the funding guidelines and on the website. For those familiar, they do look a little bit different to the sorts of priorities that we've funded in previous rounds, which tended to focus more on single aspects or complications of disease. So while there's no doubt that our previous priorities are important unmet needs, it came through strongly during this needs assessment that similarly specific priorities for this round would not move the needle to the extent that is required to contribute to closing the gap in health outcomes. Instead, what are needed are more holistic approaches to health and wellbeing, and we're confident that these identified priorities will enable the sorts of community-led innovation that is needed. Next slide, please. So that's really the why and the how for round 3. So now I'll go through, I guess, what the what of the round. So the specifics of the funding opportunity and the process for application. The round can provide between 200,000 and 1 million in TTRA funding to support eligible organisations to develop or progress preventative, diagnostic, therapeutic and disease management products, services and or models of care for diabetes and cardiovascular disease, addressing one of the priority areas and to benefit the health and wellbeing of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Projects can be funded for a maximum of 24 months, and there are no eligibility requirements for applicants to contribute additional cash or in kind. However, this is expected and we will view it favourably. Examples of possible in-kind co-contributions you could consider would be things like salaries for key personnel that are actively engaged in the project, as well as equipment or infrastructure that's been used and can be valued, and other things of that nature. The TTRA program, as Mana has already mentioned, does support a range of approaches or modalities, including digital health solutions, health service innovations, medical devices and therapeutics. And through this round of funding, we're seeking to support projects to advance the translation and implementation of a product, service or model of care. So we're looking to fund activities that will generate the evidence that is needed to demonstrate potential value and impact. So generally speaking, blue sky discovery and ideas or concepts that have no technical validation will be considered too early and therefore out of scope for this program. The TTRA program, as with the other MRFF funded programs that MTPConnect delivers, is also seeking to build capabilities and capacity around translation, commercialisation, implementation and adoption for the Australian research and clinical sectors. And to that end, our TTRA partners mentioned earlier by Mana are available to provide guidance and support, particularly for awardees who can leverage the deep expertise of our partners to support the successful delivery of their projects. An additional value-add aspect of the TTRA program is the annual partnering summits co-hosted by the research centres and MTPConnect, and which research project awardees are invited to. The partnering summits are an opportunity to develop peer-to-peer and industry links with each other and the TTRA research centres, and also to access advice, assistance and training with respect to research translation and development pathways. And importantly for this round, as already touched on by Mana, both research centres do have a significant focus on benefiting the health and wellbeing of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, as well as building the capacity and capability of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health research workforce. Next slide, please. In terms of the eligibility for the round, this is laid out in detail on pages 11 to 13 of the funding guidelines, along with a comprehensive list of eligible and ineligible expenditure. Eligible applicant organisations must have an ABN and meet the MRFF's definition of an eligible organisation. This includes medical research institutes, universities and corporations, but please note that large corporations are not eligible for the TTRA program, and we define that as having 200 or more employees. So medical research institutes, universities and community controlled organisations are not impacted by that employee cap. In addition, legally and financially separate corporate, Commonwealth, state and territory government entities are also eligible. Unlike for some other granting bodies, you do not need to have any official approval as an MRFF eligible organisation before you can apply. If you meet this definition that I've just outlined, then you're eligible. Research project applications must obviously be addressing one of the identified priority areas, and the project must include a research component. So, for example, we're not able to fund projects that are purely implementing or scaling a product, service, or model of care. However, if this project was to include an evaluation of the effectiveness or the implementation of the scaling, then this would become eligible. Applicants and organisations are able to submit multiple applications so long as they are different projects. You can also submit projects that have been submitted for other pending grant opportunities, and we do ask that you declare that within your application, and there's space for you to do that. If your project was to be submitted for multiple opportunities, you just need to be mindful that you cannot be funded for the same activities or project twice. There is also nothing precluding you from applying for this round if you applied during round 1 and round 2, as long as the project is addressing one of the round 3 priority areas. A couple of other things I wanted to highlight, since we've already received some questions around this. There are no eligibility requirements related to the qualifications of the project lead or team. So, for example, the project lead is not required to have a PhD. There is also no minimum requirements with regards to the number of team members that identify as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. Having said that, the selection criteria, which Dee will go through shortly, are designed to select projects that have built teams with the necessary background and experience to do the work proposed, and this includes having Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leadership within the project. Next slide, please. And lastly, just a brief overview of the application process. Everything you need to know is outlined in the funding guidelines, which can be accessed via the QR code on screen. This QR code also contains a link to the Notice of Intent form. Every applicant must complete a Notice of Intent prior to submitting their application. If you're thinking about applying, please complete this Notice of Intent as soon as possible with all the detail that is requested. So that's project lead, project title, a short summary, and the priority area. So this will help us ensure that there is thorough and equitable assessment of all applications. So it is really important that we do have that information. Having said this, if this info is to change slightly between your Notice of Intent and the application, that's totally fine. So once you submit that Notice of Intent, you will automatically receive an email with the link to access the application form within the Smarty Grants online platform. All applications must be submitted through Smarty Grants, but if you have completed a Notice of Intent and did not receive that email, please get in touch and we can follow up on that for you. If you have submitted a Notice of Intent but then decide not to submit an application, that is fine. We understand that many people may prefer to prepare their application offline, and that's absolutely fine for you to do so, but please do not leave it to the last minute to start and complete your application within Smarty Grants. There are strict word counts within Smarty Grants, and we would hate for you to miss the deadline because you were trying to fit things into the form at the last minute. Applications are due within Smarty Grants at 4 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time on the 28th of April. And one final note, to coincide with round 3, MTPConnect is hosting a series of webinars to highlight key elements of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health research. This series is intended for anybody with a broad interest, but it may also provide potential applicants with some key considerations for building their projects and teams. The first webinar in the series was held in November, and it focused on the principles of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health research and engaging meaningfully with community. You can watch the recording of the webinar on the MTPConnect website, or you can listen to it through the MTPConnect podcast. It was a really excellent session. So if you haven't already, I do recommend taking a look at that through the website. Future webinars are still in the planning stages, but if you sign up to the MTPConnect mailing list, that'll keep you up to date with any developments and announcements that we make over the coming weeks. So with that, I'm going to pass over to Dee Dee, who's going to run through those selection criteria with some insights from our excellent panelists. And following that, we'll open the session up for an audience Q&A.
Thank you, Erin. I'm joining the call today from the land of the Bunurong people, where I currently live and work, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So for this part of the info session, we'll go through the selection criteria. I'll be joined by a panel who were part of our co-design group and helped us design these criteria and the application process. So welcome Michelle Kennedy, Chris Lee, Megan Campbell, and Deanne Minicon. If you could please turn on your cameras and mics so that everyone can see your lovely faces. Excellent. So let's get right into it. Next slide, please. The selection criteria for this round has 5 broad themes, all equally weighted at 20%. And so equal effort should be put into each section. So these are challenge, solution, and impact, community engagement, project plan, translation and implementation, and team and capabilities. So I'll briefly go through each of these themes and allow our panel to speak on them a little bit further. So these selection criteria, as Erin mentioned, are described in our funding guidelines in comprehensive detail, and that's available for download on our website. Also, if you think of any questions for our panel, please do pop them in the Q&A box so they can address them afterwards in the Q&A section. Next slide, please. All right, so our first theme is challenge, solution, and impact. So applicants will be assessed on how well they understand the scope of the challenge, how well the product, service, and or model of care meets one of the priority areas and its potential intended impact, including preliminary evidence to support this potential. So now I'll ask our panel, can you talk a little bit more about the importance of having a clear understanding of the challenge and understanding who the product, service, and or model of care will benefit? Yeah.
I'll jump in. As researchers, we're pretty clear about setting the problem and move in this grant round. We want to ensure that this is more strengths-based. So we need these to move beyond a deficit discourse of Aboriginal disadvantage and really focus on what the solutions are going to be and how that is going to create an impact for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So it's not just about having a product or a research focus that you want to do or you want to lead, but ensuring that that fits within the holistic definition of Aboriginal health and wellbeing, and it's going to have a clear impact into our services and into our health.
Excellent. Deanne?
Yeah, just to add to that, thanks, Michelle. I guess that strength-based approach is really important, and building on that community strength that they already have and that knowledge that they have is really asking the community what their strengths are, what their knowledge are, and building on from that, I guess understanding what their priorities are. So very often we go into communities with this idea of what we think is important for the community, but in fact it might not be the priority. How do you work around that to make sure that the needs of that community is met and it's a priority for them? Thank you.
Absolutely. So being the first part of the application, this is also an opportunity for applicants to hook reviewers in with a unique value proposition. So do you have any tips on how applicants can differentiate themselves from other applications?
Go, Chris.
Sorry, that's me. Just waiting for the cue. Everyone, in the language of the Larrakia people. Good morning, all. Coming to you from the lands of the Ngunnawal Ngambri people. Look, to differentiate yourselves from one another, the scientific and medical and the technological applications are all great, but as Deanne said and Michelle said, it's really about what does the community need? It's going to be vastly different, regional, remote, urban, and as Deanne said, it's not always going to be the chronic disease there are other aspects in the community's life that, whilst not part of what we're talking about here, but consider those when you are developing overall your approach to the product or the service that you're developing over.
Excellent. That brings us nicely to our next theme. Next slide, please, Deb. Which is community engagement. So we know that community engagement is extremely important in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health research. So for this theme, applicants will be assessed on their engagement with cultural knowledge holders and integration of Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing. This means that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander individuals, communities, or organizations have been previously engaged, and that their feedback informed the design of the product, service, and/or model of care, the design of the proposed project, as well as plans for community engagement throughout delivery and future implementation. Chris, maybe you would like to speak on what meaningful community engagement entails?
Yeah, in the 3 minutes that I have, the Reader's Digest version is basically meaningful and transparent shared decision making with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community around what their health needs are, and taking into account not only the geographical but the cultural, gender, and historical aspects of the communities that you are looking at. I think for me, one of the go-tos is the National Agreement on Closing the Gap. Have a look at the 4 priority reforms. Start working your application around your engagement with communities along some of those lines over.
Excellent.
If I can add to that, it's really important that community engagement has already occurred for this. So in this section of the application, as assessors, we want to see that Aboriginal people, as we just said, have already been engaged in this process. This is a solution that they want. This is an impactful piece of research that's going to lead to change and improvements to our health and wellbeing. So we want to see in here that the community is already engaged. It's excellent if you have things like a letter of support from Aboriginal community partners so that it's a very transparent process. We wouldn't want to see an application where someone would outline that they think this could be relevant for Aboriginal people or will consult Aboriginal people at the start of our project. It's too short a grant round to have community engagement. Real, robust community engagement, as Chris spoke to, takes a long time. So we really want to be funding projects that already have really strong relationships with Aboriginal communities so that it can be translated, as we spoke about earlier.
Yeah, really great point. It's really important for them to be able to demonstrate that the product is wanted and needed by the community. All right, we can move on to the next theme. Next slide, please, Deb. All right, so let's talk about the project plan. So the project plan has to be feasible with relevant approaches and methodologies and has clearly justified activities, deliverables, milestones, and outcomes. The activities in the project plan should be geared towards the translation of a product, service, and/or model of care to a point where its potential value and impact is clear. Megan, as one of our partners who have worked closely with previous awardees, what should applicants keep in mind in creating their milestones and deliverables?
Thanks, Dee Dee. I think as Michelle and yourself and others have mentioned, 2 years is a really short period of time to work on a project. A lot of stuff is going to have to have been done beforehand, and it's going to be really important for everybody to very tightly map out their project. So having those putting a lot of thought into your Gantt chart of your deliverables and milestones, and those go, no-go decision points of what do you absolutely have to have got done in the first 3 months or your project will fall over. So yeah, a lot of like serious thought about how long these things are going to take, and also risk managing it as well. So there's a section in the application for talking about risk mitigation. So if you don't meet those timelines, are you going to still be able to do the project? And what do you need to do in order to keep the project going if you don't hit one of those milestones? So yeah, very important to do that thinking up front.
Absolutely. So we know that ethics has a huge impact on the feasibility of a project, especially keeping within that tight 24-month time frame, which is why we're planning to hold a webinar dedicated to ethics in our webinar series. But for now, do you have any early tips for applicants regarding ethics?
Yes, I do. Well, it really does stem from the other sort of conversations we've had around Aboriginal engagement and governance. Knowing what Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander ethical research guidelines say, you'll be able to answer those questions anyway, because you've already got those long-standing community partnerships. But Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have advocated for our right to govern the ethics process. And so it's really important that applicants receive not just an ethics approval from their institution, but ethics approval and governance from an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community controlled organisation, acknowledging they aren't in every state and territory in our country, but we really want to see that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are leading the research, they're governing the research, that they've approved the research, which is going to take some time. So we would really like to see applications that already have Aboriginal ethics, if it's already sort of a progressed research project, and being really clear about what ethics you have and how Aboriginal people are governing your research project, but then also an articulation of what is needed into the future. So if you've got Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander ethics for your development phase, a clear articulation in those milestones, what's needed. Do you need an ethics variation to an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander research committee? When would that be? And what processes you would need to follow to ensure that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander ethics is upheld?
Excellent. So I guess we can move on to the next theme. Next slide, please, Deb. So our next theme is translation and implementation. So applications will be assessed on the product, service, and/or there's potential for future implementation and adoption, benefiting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. So this would include how well it fits within clinical workflows and individual health journeys, as well as having the appropriate methodology for ongoing process and outcome evaluation. Megan, as our implementation science expert, would you like to expound on this a little bit?
Yeah, thanks, Dee. So this section is all about how you're planning to evaluate your product, service or model of care to inform future uptake. So we'd be looking for you to tell us about your projects. So for projects that involve changing or introducing a new model of care, for example, selecting an appropriate implementation science framework will help guide researchers in addressing a significant proportion of the criteria in this section. Implementation frameworks such as CIFA, Paris, KTA, REAIM, you might have heard those terms before, will help guide and pull together things like your context assessment and telling you the area that you're working in. Stakeholder engagement will help you pull together all of that stuff that you're doing, as well as measuring acceptability and sustainability of your product or service into the future. So it'll just form a framework around it and make sure that you're ticking all of those boxes. Sustainability and future scale and spread will also be reliant on knowing that a product or model or is cost effective. So using health economics in your evaluation is also important. If your project is developing a therapeutic, medtech or digital health solution, you'll need to ensure you address things like regulation, commercialization, and also future potential funding models for your device or product. If you're unsure of any of the best ways to measure or demonstrate any of these elements, you're very welcome to reach out to any of the TTRA partner organisations through MTPConnect. Michelle, are there any additional considerations for evaluation in the context of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander-led research?
I would link back to the ethics conversation, ensuring that knowledge is translated in partnership with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We want to make sure that research that's being conducted goes back to our community. So ensuring that there's some knowledge translation articulated in your application relating specifically to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and communities. And I guess the other thing is just to ensure that when we're looking at evaluation and we're utilising those frameworks, that we're embedding Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leadership in that evaluation, that we're not removing a science component to an Aboriginal community component. There are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander researchers and community members and managers and CEOs that all have a lot of value to add to an evaluation process. So I'd like to really clearly see how Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are involved throughout the whole life course of the research. Didn't know whether Deanne or Chris wanted to add anything as well.
I guess when it comes to that commercialisation component of the research is, what does this mean for Aboriginal Islander communities who've been involved in this research in terms of giving back, and one of the things that will contribute to improving health outcomes for Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander peoples is employment, and that's employment beyond the research grant. And so commercialisation is one of those things that is a consideration in your application. Then really need to think about what is, if you're taking from the community, what are we giving back, and how does the community benefit from that as well?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. There's also that aspect of consultation fatigue in some communities, particularly in the regional, remote and outer remote communities. So just be conscious of that when you are developing up your community engagement plans, as Megan and Michelle and others have said. If you haven't already done it by now, yeah, you might need to get a move on. But other than that, yeah, all good.
Excellent. And that ties in nicely to our last theme. Next slide, please. Which is team and capabilities. So all the applications will be assessed on the project team's composition, experience, diversity, and access to the requisite infrastructure. So the team should demonstrate cultural competence and a good track record in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health research. Where possible, as Deanne mentioned, they should also be employing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and embedding Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander leadership in all aspects of the project. So would you like to, Deanne, would you like to speak a little bit more on what it means to embed Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leadership into a project?
Yeah, absolutely. What we've been saying the whole session is Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander employment throughout, from leadership all the way through data collection and even into the data analysis. Because what your lens is on a particular bit of data will be different to what an Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander person might be able to interpret that data as well, and taking into consideration all the historical aspects and the social and environmental impacts that impact on a community around their diabetes. So really taking that Aboriginal Islander leadership and engagement and employment, valuing also that knowledge of Aboriginal Islander peoples have. We've been experts in Aboriginal Islander health for very many years, and just health generally in every aspect. And so we've got a lot of knowledge, and it should be valued, and we should be able to contribute that into the current work that you're doing. I'll just quickly check if Chris or Michelle had anything else to add.
No, that's deadly, sis.
You did a good job. I just probably wanted to link back to what Erin said about it's not just about the person who has a PhD leading the research. And this is such an exciting grant opportunity for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander PhD students, undergraduate students, to be able to have opportunities to be a chief investigator on a research project, and to have opportunities to broaden their skills and expertise. Acknowledging what Dee said, we have so much knowledge and expertise to add to research. So really thinking about the team and the makeup of the research team beyond just formal qualifications and beyond peer-reviewed publications. We do impactful research in our communities all the time, and being able to articulate the team that you've brought together and all of the different skills and expertise that everyone has. Please, I've seen this in so much of my peer review, do not make an Aboriginal person a mentor for a non-Indigenous researcher. Make sure that Aboriginal people are the experts and they have the decision making. As Dee said, we have skills beyond collecting data from our community. We know how to analyse it. We know how to write it up. So ensuring that this is really clearly articulated so that the assessors can see really clearly who the team are, how everyone is going to work together to do the project that, as we said, is articulated in your milestones.
Yeah. In what ways can a team demonstrate their track record with Aboriginal health research?
Well, it doesn't just have to be research, right? So we're talking about impactful Aboriginal health services, outcomes, translations. So a lot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that work in Aboriginal community-controlled organisations or other types of health organisations can have a really strong track record in making change, in changing the way a health service is run, in developing new programs and initiatives. Prior to my research career, I did so many things that were never tracked as research. They were just me doing things for my community. So there's things that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people do every day that we can articulate as translational work and impactful work. But I don't know, Dee or Chris, if you wanted to add to that question.
No, it's great. Thank you.
All right. I think you've given our applicants a lot of good tips and a lot of good advice, and that brings us nicely to our Q&A portion. A big thank you to our panel, and I think I'll hand over back to Mana to chair the Q&A session.
Thank you so much, Dee, and to all our panelists, Deanne, Chris, Michelle, Megan, for providing some color to the selection criteria and hopefully passing on those practical tips for those applying. Well, that concludes the formal parts of our information session, but I'll ask our panelists to please stay on, and I'll also invite Aaron to join back for the Q&A panel session. So I'll now invite all our audience members to put through any questions that remain unanswered in the Q&A box. While I give everyone a bit of time to do that, I will just remind you that the round 3 research projects are open now, and it will close on the 28th of April at 4 p.m. AEST. As previously highlighted, it's important to submit the notice of intent early to gain access to the application form and submit the application. And we cannot accept late submissions, so please be mindful of the time zones and don't leave entering your application into the Smarty Grants platform until the last minute. The system is sensitive to word count and other errors and will not let you submit an application if any text field is over the word count or a required field is left empty. So not leaving enough time to correct any errors is not a valid excuse for a late submission. The TTRA team is on hand to help any troubleshoot and also the Smarty Grants help desk, but we were not able to assist you if you contact us within 20 minutes to go. So I will highly encourage you to start entering your responses into Smarty Grants early, especially for those sections which are unlikely to change. So fill in the tables first, as this can be time consuming, and remember to save as you go. The system doesn't accommodate more than one user in the portal at a time. So if you're sharing a login details, please make sure that the only one of you is in Smarty Grants at the time. Otherwise, the work of one could override the other and it is not recoverable. So if anyone has to duck off before the end of the Q&A, there will be an anonymous survey for you to complete upon exit, which will help us to know what worked well and where we can improve for next time. So I guess I will now look at our Q&A box and to start on some of the questions. So before I begin, I noticed there's a couple of project-specific questions in the Q&A chat. I just want to remind the audience members, as indicated earlier, any question that's related to whether your project's within scope or how it aligns with the priority areas, we will appreciate you contacting directly with us using the TTRA email address, so we can, make sure we have the specific information gathered from you to make that assessment correctly. All right, so let me jump onto the questions. So the first one from Deborah Welch, and that's actually to you, Erin, regarding your comments about no organizational funding contribution is required, but is expected and will be viewed favorably, whether you could confirm that. And the following on question is, could there be a different standard for community control organizations who do not have access to discretionary funds, where nearly all funds are grants and tied to project activities? Erin, would you like to answer that?
Thanks, Manna. And yes, you did pick that up correctly. That is not an eligibility requirement to contribute cash or in kind. But yes, we would expect it, and we would view it favourably. And the reason why we say we expect it and we view it favourably is because to us it indicates that there's buy-in for the project, and that the organisation, the lead organisation, and the partners that are involved are committed to seeing the success of the project. We do consider both cash and in kind. In kind is a really great way to be able to show that commitment to the project without needing any of that discretionary cash that you rightly point out a lot of organisations don't have. So in kind can be a really good way to go for that. In terms of the different standard, I think it will come down to the assessment of the projects, and it'll be on, you know, the entire project will be assessed, not just whether or not you can provide cash and in kind. And so I think the fact that, you know, community controlled organisations could potentially be leading a project will certainly be considered by the assessment panel.
Thank you, Erin. We got one question that got one upvote. Can a CI submit as a lead for 2 separate projects?
I guess I can take that one as well. Yes, absolutely. Just as long as those are 2 separate projects and they don't have too much overlap or any overlap, then yes, you can.
Excellent. Easy. All right. So we have got a question around how to connect with appropriate Aboriginal organisations for collaborations. Maybe I'll give this one to Michelle, Christian. Any of you would like to make a comment on this one?
Look, I think at this late stage, developing a relationship with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community-controlled organisations is problematic, however, not impossible. So you have a state affiliate, particularly in the Aboriginal health sector, state affiliates, depending on which state you come from. There's AH and MRC, Quake in Queensland, AMZANT in the Northern Territory, etc. And then there are local community-controlled Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisations that are working in some of these spaces. But I would probably reach out to some of the peak bodies first, and then start working and develop your bona fides, and then start working your way down. Universities might be a good contact. I know Michelle, put your hand up. Over.
That was a good answer. It's important, you know, we've spoken not just about having collaborations, but having Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leadership. So it is really important that this probably isn't a grant round for someone who's new to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health. We're talking about a 2-year-long translational research grant. This is really targeted at researchers who have established relationships, trusted relationships, and sound Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander governance and leadership. But Dee, did you want to add anything?
No, I completely agree with both of you. Thanks.
Also, probably just a flag. I work at an Aboriginal community-controlled organisation, and we do, I'm sure Chris does as well, get bombarded with requests. So just because you reach out to an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisation, if you don't get a response, that may be your response. I know people ask me all the time, well, I sent them an email or I called and they never got back to me. We have a lot of competing priorities working in Aboriginal community controlled. So just being really respectful of that when you are trying to establish new partnerships or collaborations.
Yeah, maybe I'll just quickly add, in the application form, we also ask the applicant to provide letters of support if you have, you know, those identified organization you want to partner, and we will definitely look at for evidence that the partnership is not a brand new one, that you have those you know, previous conversations. So yeah, thanks everyone for answering that question. Maybe I'll continue on while I have Michelle here. There is a specific question directed to you. It says from an anonymous attendee. Michelle gave us an example for theme 5 that a project might include a PhD student on the team. This suggests the student would contribute a task as part of their PhD. However, funding is not provided to fund the PhD directly. Is this correct?
I want to make sure that I'm understanding this correctly. My example of a PhD student, I have done it recently with a grant application. It has nothing to do with their PhD, but it's about building capacity and opportunities for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander PhD students. So the example I was giving was just to really think beyond having a PhD as qualifying someone to be a chief investigator on the research project, but also looking at other opportunities. When I was finishing my PhD, I didn't really have people teaching me how to write grants or opportunities. And so I feel really passionate about making sure that those are embedded. But there could also be, I have another grant I've just submitted where I have an Aboriginal research assistant. She's really like a project manager, and she's an investigator on the research project. She's integral to the implementation of the research. She has just as much say as any other investigator. So really just thinking beyond Western qualifications for your research team. I hope that helps.
Thank you. All right, let's see. So there's a few more questions more about the admin side of the program. So maybe more of that is addressing to you, Erin. So the first one is, when are successfully applicants announced, and what would be considered start date for successful projects?
Thanks, Manna. So yes, the expected key dates are listed in the funding guidelines as well. We would expect application outcomes, so all applicants to learn about the outcome around mid-July. I can't promise that that'll also be when the public announcement occurs, because we will work with the Minister for Health's office to work on that announcement. But applicants will learn of their outcomes mid-July, and we would expect projects to begin in September. So we have a hard stop for round 2, which is August 2025. If your project is taking the full 2-year term, then you would need to start in September 2023. If your project is less than 24 months, then that start date could shift a little bit.
Thank you. There's also a question about, could the panel please expand why the corporation over 200 employees are excluded? I think that's another question for you, Anna.
Yeah, so this is, I guess this is not an MRFF rule per se. This is how MTPConnect has set up the grant opportunity. And it's basically to allow particularly small to medium-sized enterprises the opportunity to apply for this funding, rather than sort of say a big pharmaceutical company. The grant scheme itself is really designed for either medical research institutes, universities, things like that, or small to medium-sized enterprises rather than the large corporations.
Great, thanks. There is a question regarding, can a research focused on chronic disease with CVD or diabetes as one component is eligible for application?
I can take that one again if you like. I'd say yes, that's eligible for application. I'd just be really careful within your application to articulate which parts of your application are going to be directly looking at cardiovascular disease and diabetes, because obviously we're trying to fund cardiovascular disease and diabetes projects. You can absolutely talk about how what you're developing might be applicable more broadly to chronic disease, but definitely bringing it back to cardiovascular disease and diabetes. And I would expect a lot of things would be more broadly applicable to chronic disease.
Great, thank you. So following on the question that Michelle previously answered about PhD student, there were a couple of similar follow-on questions about whether the TTRA grant can cover PhD scholarships.
Was that for me again, was it? Sorry. I'd have to double check on the eligible expenditure, but I believe that would be an eligible expenditure manner. You might actually be able to back me up on that.
Yeah, so that would be eligible expenditure. That's in the funding guidelines that you can look at any specific expenditure, but the confirmation is that that should be under eligible expenditure. Yep. All right. Okay. So there's a question from Brett Biles regarding appropriate implementation and evaluation frameworks. I assume it is okay to use Aboriginal created frameworks. Guess this is a question either to Michelle, Megan, or
Yeah, absolutely. We would love, I think the start of it, it says Indigenous ways of knowing, being and doing. Absolutely, we would love to see Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander developed frameworks being utilised in your research.
is there anything you want to add to that, Megan?
No, I guess, yes, absolutely. I think that shows an incredible insight into tailoring something to the context. It would be fantastic to use an Indigenous framework, but it wouldn't be essential, because the basis of using an implementation framework is actually tailoring it to the environment. It is just a set of guidelines, and it will tell you that you need to engage with your stakeholders. And in this instance, it needs to be tailored to the communities where you're doing the research. And then because it'll be led by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, it will bring that knowledge to it as well. So not essential, but definitely encouraged.
And just to add to that, there's quite a bit of literature of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander academics applying, say, the RE-AIM framework to their research. So there is some literature out there that helps support your thinking of how you apply, you know, an implementation framework to an Aboriginal health project.
Thanks, Michelle. Thanks, Megan. All right. I think we'll have one more that's currently on the chat. So it says, based on feedback from community, we want to combine two programs so that people do not get told to go to separate two programs, one for diabetes and one for CVD, as many have both. Both programs would co-design with communities by separate research groups. Can we include and fund a work package within the application that will resolve the intellectual property issues by bringing together these programs, as this will be a major barrier to translation? I guess this is one of the type of question we prefer you to contact directly with the TTRA team, because everyone's situation is a bit different. We'll need to assess on your work. Thanks. All right. I think that's everything I can see that's currently in the chat, but we did also ask people if they have any questions they want to cover when they register. So I'll bring that up and see if there's anything we haven't yet addressed, and we can do that in the remaining time. Let me have a look. So there is a question regarding, does the grant include funding for GMP manufacture for late-stage clinical trial? Is that something, Erin, you could cover?
Yeah, that would be an eligible expense, but again, there's the full list of eligible expenditure included in the funding guidelines.
Thank you. So there's also a question regarding confirming childhood obesity intervention would be seen as diabetes and CVD prevention for this core.
And yes, I would say yes to that. Preventative measures are very much within scope for the program, and that would be, I think, fall under that category. There is also another question that's come into the Q&A box there, Manna.
Yep. So we have a question coming through. Where a health service looking to partner with an ACHS and a university, does the more than 200 staff exclusion apply here?
So the over 200 staff exclusion applies only to corporations. So if you are an Aboriginal controlled organisation, it would not apply. And the same would be true for a corporate Commonwealth, state or territory government entity as well. So just corporations.
Thank you. Another comments or questions from the people that register, it says partnering with industry, the does and don'ts. So for this information session, it's not something we'll cover, but we do have a national stakeholder engagement team within MTPConnect, and it's a great, potential topic that we could do within our company. So we'll bring that to the team.
The other thing I'll just add actually to my answer before, Manna, the 200 employee cap only applies to the lead organisation. So you can partner with organisations that have over 200 employees. That's not an issue. It's just the lead organisation. Yeah,
that's right. So the eligibility requirement that you see in the funding guidelines, that's only for the applicant itself. So with the partners, that's not the case. All right. Okay. I think that's all I can see from our registered list. We have just a couple of minutes left, but maybe I can go back to all our panelists today, just for any sort of final word or final tips for the applicants about to embark on this journey, because I know this is quite a different round to our previous round 1 and round 2 of TTRA research projects. If you have any advice in how they should go about, starting their application, that community engagement piece that we sort of touched on earlier, but as well as the ethics, but is there anything else that the applicant should be aware of as they do? So maybe I'll kick off from Deanne.
Oh gosh. Oh look, no, from my point of view, I think that there's been quite a bit of information that's been addressed throughout the whole session. I'll just leave it at that. Thank you. Pass it on to the others.
Thanks, Dan.
I'll jump in.
Oh, okay, go, Michelle.
I was going to say, it might seem harsh, but don't tell us what you think we want to read. Tell us the detail. So often we read a grant that says, we are going to have appropriate governance. We want to know who is on the governance. Who have you already worked with? Tell us the story and show us clearly how you're going to embed Aboriginal leadership. Don't just tell us the words that you think are most appropriate on the page. Chris.
No, I was just going to say, look, keep checking in with the TTRA team. I know Aaron and Mana and the rest of the crew, wealth of knowledge and information, and they also have extensive contacts out there. So use them in terms of building up your application. And as Mana said, or Aaron, don't leave it till the last minute.
Thanks for emphasising that, Chris. Megan?
I would actually just echo what Chris has said, that MTPConnect are there. They can answer any questions, put you in touch with partners who can help you through this process. So get your application started as soon as possible and work out if you have any questions and reach out, because they don't bite and we're quite a friendly bunch and we're happy to answer if we can.
Thank you very much, Megan. I would just like to emphasise this is not the only time that you're able to ask questions from us or seeking, advice, or us, not just us, but us as well as our modality partners. So if you need to reach out for a question, especially around eligibility or the project alignment, please do email the TTRA inbox, and we are always happy here to help and also facilitate that conversation with the partners if you need it. So as we only got 1 minute to go, I think we kept it really well with the time. I would really like to thank all our presenters and panelists today, Aaron, Dee Dee, Deanne, Michelle, Chris, Megan, and our behind the scenes with Deb and Nat, as well as Lee, Andrew, and Grace for their assistance. We want to thank you for joining us, and we hope that this information session provided practical tips and advice for you moving forward with the development of your application. Also, just to remind you, please stay tuned for the webinar series that was mentioned previously that we'll be hosting, which is intended for anyone with a broad interest in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health research, but may also provide potential applicants with key elements to consider when building their projects and teams. So thank you again. Deb, would you like to put up the screen again with the survey? So just to remind everyone again that we will have a survey for you to please complete upon your exit.